Now to the Roundtable. We're joined by Colin Reed, a professor with the Economics and Finance Department at SUNY Plattsburgh, Clinton County legislator and business owner. And also with us is Bryan, who recently retired as a business and economics columnist with the Montreal Gazette. Nice to have you both here again. We're taping midweek. August is behind us. Many would say thank goodness for that, but September is starting out right where August left off, with the markets in turmoil and a lot of volatility going on.
Yeah, it was pretty scary stuff for a while. I think the opinion of most of the really smart economic analysts that I try and keep track of has kind of solidified behind the story that this really was a correction in the stock market. It wasn't some kind of a little advanced tremor of a big economic earthquake. And people's memories, of course, of the terrible, terrible crash in 2008, 2009 make everybody nervous as heck. But in fact, there don't seem to be the kind of economic links between the real epicenter of this, which is China, and North America, that it would take to set off an economic slump. And of course, the evidence of how the North American economy is going, at least on the American side of the border, is pretty encouraging. Job creation has been very healthy, and the economy kind of has fast spurts and then slowdowns. The slowdowns seem to come toward the early part of the year for the past few years, but there's always been a recovery, and there's always been a good rate of growth for the whole year, and there's always been growth in employment and growth in consumer spending that is sufficient to keep things getting better. The one kind of weak part of the story is that wages haven't been building up fast enough to really make the recovery as strong as people would like. But it certainly it doesn't show any signs of dying. In Canada, of course, there's a slightly different story, but that's not really terribly material because it's concentrated in one part of the Canadian economy, oil, and we're a commodity economy, so we can't avoid that when the price of oil globally collapses. Actually, there are signs now that the Canadian economy is coming out of recession. It's been in a recession for the first half of the year. The government has a horror of uttering the R word, so you won't hear that from the government of Canada, but it has been in recession, and it's pretty much official now with the second quarter economic growth figures in Canada just out. But not a bad recession. I mean, there's no such thing as a good recession, but there are very mild ones, and this is a very mild one. Really, really bad for the part of the economy, mostly centered in Alberta, that is highly dependent on the price of oil, because Canadian oil tends to be high-priced oil. So when the price collapses, then there's no real profit there.
And as we saw, the price did collapse. It rebounded tremendously the last few days,
yep.
up 25, 27%, taking a few more hits again midweek as we're taping. Oil back down, giving back some of those gains. Jay mentioned the correction. This is the long overdue correction that a number of people have been waiting a number of years for.
Perhaps unlike the very large downfall back in 2008, 2009, there's no simmering problem out there. There's no subprime loans. There's no reason to believe that international credit markets are going to freeze up. So I think this is relatively contained, and many people say even a relatively healthy thing to occur every once in a while. Now, the volatility and the rapidity of the correction was unnerving to some. Combine that with the falling out of the prices in the oil market, and there was pause for concern, but I think cooler heads prevailed.
One of the really encouraging things that you can see on the economic perspective, even in China, where there really is a growing indication that the whole economy is slowing down, is that there's nothing that would apparently trigger a real collapse, because China is not one of these third world countries that is heavily, heavily indebted to other countries in the currency of, say, the United States. Countries that depend on borrowing in US dollars, and then they have economic troubles at home and their own currency plummets, so their US dollar debt is suddenly worth twice as much as it used to be to them, get in serious trouble. That's not the case in China. China is actually a very big, of course, creditor, as we all know. So China has more than enough resources to cushion the economic fallout from its internal indebtedness, which is pretty substantial, but it tends to be domestic indebtedness.
China, of course, the second largest economy in the world, but we've been talking on this program for months now about the economic slowdown there. This wasn't out of the blue, and so why now?
If I could tell you that, and indeed if I could have told you that a few months ago, then of course I wouldn't be bothering with this program. I'd be on my yacht someplace in the Mediterranean.
Yes.
But on a more serious note, obviously you just can't predict when people are going to become anxious enough for the psychology of the market to take it down, because that's really what it is. There was a tremendously speculative psychology going on in China, and to their eternal discredit, the government of China encouraged that speculative psychology in the, I think, very foolishly mistaken belief that this would make the government more popular, that people would feel that they were getting wealthy in an economy that the government had kind of helped along. But how they managed to overlook the fate of every speculative bubble in the history of the human race, I'm not so sure. Because now, of course, they look terrible, and they kept trying to inflate the bubble even after it started to deflate, and just made themselves look not only foolish, but not very capable.
Of course, when we look at the China situation, we look at it with our eyes, where in our countries, the government is relatively benign in the market. It doesn't have a lot of an effect in the stock market. But in China, the government is expected to maintain the buoyancy of the entire economy. The government was expected in this recent case to start going in and buying shares of publicly traded companies to prop up the stock market, something that we couldn't even imagine or fathom in our own country. So we're imposing upon them some kind of market-oriented standards for a pretty much decidedly non-market-oriented macroeconomy, even though the microeconomy of China is very market-oriented.
And now
it still depends an awful lot on politics there than just economics.
Now that I've piled on a lot of easy criticism of another country that has very different economic mores, I guess I really probably should be reminding myself that right back here in the Western Hemisphere, we had a very serious economic collapse that was caused by our own very, very poor and predictable policies in the financial world that permitted the phenomenon of subprime loans being sliced and diced into incomprehensible securities that people bought thinking they were safe, and of course they weren't safe at all. And that all fell apart, and that was predictable that it would. We just didn't know when. And before that, there was the tech bubble and bust. That one is one of the most astonishing ones of all, in the sense that people didn't kind of back off a little bit, because Alan Greenspan, the most respected person in the financial world back in those days, warned, about 3.5 years in advance of the popping of the bubble, that there was an air of irrational exuberance in the market. And there was a book called Irrational Exuberance that appeared just about the time the bubble popped by a Yale economist, Mr. Schiller, that warned that, geez, these things really can't keep going forever, that people just didn't get the message.
Well, it looked as if things were calming down at the end of last week. The markets gained back about a third of what they had lost. But then again, as we get into this week, more jitters. China puts out a manufacturing report, and the global markets react again.
I tend to think it's going to stabilize a little bit, though. The markets are just volatile right now. We're not quite so highly levered in retail investing in the United States as they are in China. It's not abnormal for people to borrow many times over how much they invest in China. Hedge funds can do that here, but the average investor can't. So when you have a fall in 1 week, it can usually have ripples in the week after as people's margin calls are coming due, or they're forced to sell a little bit. But I'd be very surprised if it doesn't stabilize.
There are kind of a couple of things that have been, I think, big propellants for the the stock market boom. It's really been a stock market boom that we've seen since about 2009. One has been half-decent world economic growth that has been gradually getting a little better, and pretty much all of that has been created by China, because China was growing very rapidly and was already a very large economy. We weren't as dependent on that in North America because the US economy is so incredibly self-sufficient, but they're pretty dependent on Chinese growth all through Asia and to some extent in Europe. So that's the Chinese growth being something of an economic propellant, and we can see now that's going to be much weaker. So there's real reason to be concerned about that, just not reason to be panicky. The second thing is virtual zero interest rates, which means that even if it doesn't make sense to invest in stocks, you've really got no place else to go. So you might as well invest in stocks in the hope that you'll earn something. The dividend rate on a decent stock may not be more than 3% or so, but that's pretty good in an era where you're going to get much less than that investing in a government bond, if you forget about the fact that stocks can go down as well as up and erase a lot of your dividend income. But basically, both those things are changing. Now, the interest rate picture is changing. The Fed is now actually stating that, yeah, probably rates will start to creep up pretty soon. So both those things, I think, make investors nervous. And when they come together, I guess it's a real double whammy.
Has the Fed been spooked at all by this? Is there any thought that the planned interest rate hike probably for September may be put on hold?
Well, they're meeting right now, as a matter of fact. Just finished a meeting of finance ministers and federal officials, and they did talk about the pros and cons of delaying the rate increase. Many of us thought it would be in September. They want to stay ahead of inflation, so they can't wait till we see 3% inflation and then start raising the interest rate. They're trying to time the interest rate hike to coincide with the increase in inflation. But it seems to be that was looking more like a December rate increase than a September rate increase until you saw some of the comments over this last weekend about how, the inflation may be looming and we do want to stay ahead of it.
So more likely September than
I still
December.
think more likely December.
Likely
Janet
December.
Yellen, I think, is very careful about these things, but she's got a couple of other people on her board that'll a little bit more inflation bearers.
I agree with you. Yeah.
And we've been talking about how the markets have been preparing for this. So when we see that happen, we shouldn't expect too much volatility in the markets.
That's right, but we always have that, what the heck was that, even though we've been expecting it for quite some time.
I wouldn't say you shouldn't expect too much volatility in markets. Markets are very rational in the longer term and completely irrational from day to day and week to week. And things that are totally predictable and were indeed predicted by the folks in charge at the Fed still, for reasons it's hard to comprehend, seem to scare the daylights out of some of the flightier big money people in the market.
Let's talk politics. Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, who is one of the 17 Republicans running for president, raised a lot of eyebrows this past weekend when he said that he would take a tougher stand on border security, and not just the southern border with Mexico, but he said it is a legitimate idea to discuss building a wall separating the U.S. from Canada as well. There was a lot of pushback immediately, a lot of criticism. U.S. Senator Pat Leahy from Vermont called it one of the craziest ideas he's heard in this campaign so far. But obviously, there have been terrorist plots that have been planned in Canada, and back in 2000, there was the one where an Algerian national was going to cross the border and bomb Los Angeles International Airport.
And was caught right at the border.
And was caught, yes. But Leahy, of course, saying that would be crazy to put up any more of a barrier between the U.S. and Canada.
So I think the smarter approach we've talked about on this show before is to continue to develop and foster a good relationship at the security level between Canada and the U.S. So we have one security zone, and then Canada and the U.S. both be very vigilant in watching who comes into the combined area. And we have seen a lot of cooperation between the security forces on each side of the border.
Yeah, that would have been, the idea of a wall, I think, is, not to be critical, but insane. But certainly the idea of tightening up security at the border is not insane and has been done. And if Mr. Walker had said something along the lines of we need to tighten up security, say back in 2001 or 2002, he might have had a point, because the government of that time in Canada was, I think, a little bit too relaxed about border security issues and security issues within Canada. The Harper government, you can criticize on many grounds, but you cannot criticize them on their vigilance at the border and their focus on security against terrorist plots. They've been extremely energetic about building stronger links with American security agencies. So I don't think many Canadians even paid attention to Mr. Walker's comments, because you hear things like that from time to time coming from people, but when it's coming from a guy who is the governor of a border state, which has a bigger border in Wisconsin than New Hampshire has with Canada, and suddenly he becomes aware of a potential security threat at the Canadian border only after he travels to another border state where he's campaigning in a presidential primary, maybe you take that with a grain of salt.
He did do a bit of backtracking earlier this week, saying that it wasn't his idea. He had heard it from a number of people in New Hampshire, the idea, and that he was simply raising it as an issue for the campaign. A virtual wall, maybe, but the cost for actually physically building a wall, 5,500 miles, that would be issue number one, and then having your largest trading partner separated by a wall would be the other.
I think really the focus for the last couple of years between Canada and the United States has been lessening the very significant economic cost of the very tough security measures that are already in place. The idea is keep security just as tight as it is now, but ease the commercial transactions, because in a just-in-time world, it's really not a very smart thing to have between these very, very close economic partners to have a border where things don't move well.
Congresswoman Elise Stefanik led a trade mission across the border to Montreal a couple of weeks ago. A lot of the focus there was tourism, as you might expect, and continued trade, and of course the relationship between Canadian companies already in the U.S. and in northern New York and Clinton County in the transportation industry, but also talk about possibly trying to lure some of the aerospace companies from Canada to take a look across the border as well.
Of course, we've tried that before. We've had good relationships with Pratt & Whitney Canada here before as well. And Laurentian, if you think about it, it is an international effort. It is kind of on again and off again. I understand that those discussions went relatively well in Montreal. I was speaking with Senator Little on this, and she was pleased to see the delegation going. So I think these are conversations we should continue to have. And of course, combine that with the recent federal initiative to put customs authority at our Clinton County airport, make it a true international airport, and the investment Clinton County is making in this. I think that certainly a lot of the infrastructure and foundations are there, and be relatively easy pickings to do some more in aerospace.
Even if you're a Montrealer, I think the idea of having some functions or some elements of production across the border in Clinton County is not necessarily a bad one, because the alternative might be for those kinds of things, if they're just not able to be done as efficiently as they should be in Montreal, the alternative might be to have them go to Mexico or go to Vietnam or go to China or go to India. There are lots of countries that can participate in high-tech manufacturing these days, and keeping a close-knit complex that does go across the border but doesn't go thousands of miles away sounds like it could be a win-win.
For mass transit, there's the incentive to cross the border into the U.S. so that, because many contracts require a certain percentage of American-made product, the buses and the rail cars have to have a certain percentage that's made in America. Not the same for the aerospace industry.
Correct, far more international than domestic.
No, I would have guessed, and obviously people in Clinton County thought of this many years ago, that the superb air base here, now Clinton County International, would be the basis for some pretty good initiatives that you could try to get going. And we haven't seen a great deal come of that yet. But these things, I think, tend to have a very long gestation period. So I wouldn't exclude the possibility that could happen in the future.
And as Colin mentioned, right now, the airport certainly is seeing a huge number of Canadians, primarily from the Montreal area, crossing the border to fly out of Plattsburgh, taking charter flights to Florida right now. But by getting the okay from the federal government to put customs agents right at the airport as part of the $55 million expansion, the hope is that some of the same charter airlines or new airlines are going to take a look at international markets, the Caribbean, Mexico, and flying Canadians nonstop there.
Correct.
Even Cuba.
And Montreal doesn't really have a small airport, a small affordable airport like a lot of major towns do. Even in Vancouver, for instance, a small affordable airport for Vancouver is Bellingham, just on the other side of the border. So it'd be attractive. You can really get from downtown Montreal to the seat in your airplane, your flight, about the same time, whether you're flying out of Trudeau or flying into Plattsburgh. It's It takes maybe 45 minutes longer with traffic to get down here, but the process and the parking and that sort of thing is so much simpler. So I think the idea is to build that economy of scale out of the airport, attract some of these international flights, and then start putting that airport on the maps. We actually get more domestic flights. I think that's really something that the Clinton County citizens are looking for. If we're going to truly be this area of quality of life, nice amenities, hope to attract and retain young people, the 3,000 families by 2040 kind of philosophy we've been talking about, we really have to make it a little bit more accessible domestically as well. So I think international is actually kind of an odd but sensible step towards that.
I know
your idea of sort of a second airport really clicks with me, because if you're in Boston and you want to take a less expensive flight, you might fly out of Rhode Island, or you might fly out of New Hampshire, Manchester, New Hampshire, and you jump on a Southwest flight and go across the country at a really good price. Mm-hmm. And it's not that inconvenient to drive that far, because when you go to the airport, there are long delays anyway, even if the airport's a block away. So mm-hmm. It's not a big deal if you have to have a half-hour drive. And when JetBlue came in to Burlington, Vermont, I remember Burlington, Vermont suddenly became a very attractive place for a Montrealer to begin a trip someplace else in the United States.
Right.
The same thing could happen here in Plattsburgh, and I, for one, would be so happy to see it happen.
Mm-hmm. And with the normalization of relations between the U.S. and Cuba, some of the steps we're seeing are flights from the U.S. to Cuba, of JFK and Miami. One possibility may be direct flights to Cuba from Plattsburgh, and again, that would be for the large number of Canadians who travel to Cuba as tourists to vacation.
Correct, and who've been flying to Cuba for decades. Yeah. That's one of the destinations for people on the East Coast, to make it a little bit cheaper and more convenient for them to do so. I think it'd be a good draw.
Coming up in a couple of weeks, downtown Plattsburgh, the Merchants, the Downtown Association, is going to hold another downtown destination. This is basically where a number of businesses are open on Sunday, and part of an effort to really try to let people know, especially Canadians, that the downtown is vibrant and alive on weekends.
We're pretty excited about that. We try to time the destination downtown events around some long weekend, hopefully long weekends that Canadians may be coming down as well. We did one in May. It was quite a success. Over 30 businesses ended up participating, opening up their doors on Sunday. This one we're piggybacking on the Battle of Plattsburgh, to try to keep all these individuals that come to town for the Battle of Plattsburgh events in town another day on Sunday the 13th, following the big events on Saturday the 12th. So we're excited about that. We've got probably at least 20 merchants online right now, so we expect to be up to upwards of 30 again. We'll have music downtown, events, giveaways, discounts. As before, people who come and visit us can fill out a little passport and enter it for prizes. So we're quite looking forward to doing a couple of these every season.
The thought is that more businesses need to be open on Sunday than in the past, because visitors from Quebec would cross the border and find many businesses and restaurants closed.
Of course, and as an unofficial downtown visitor center, we see that in our shop. Actually, a lot of people saying, well, what is there to do on a Sunday? Things seem pretty dead here. So we would like to change that. If you also think about, even for our locals who work Monday through Friday, so they have 2 days, discretionary days, to do something downtown. And if all the merchants choose to be closed half of those days, I think we're really doing ourselves a little bit of a disservice. We encourage merchants who obviously need a break every once in a while to maybe take Monday or Tuesday as that discretionary day off, but let's see what we can do about building up activity on Sundays.
We talked a little bit about politics and the presidential campaign underway in the States. Of course, it's also election time in Canada right now. When we see you next time, we'll be right down to the wire, just a couple of weeks before the October election. But now, as we head into the beginning of September, are voters in Canada paying a little more attention, and what are we seeing as far as the race right now?
They are beginning to pay attention. There's been one debate of the political leaders, and it was a very lively debate. It was extremely consequential, I think, for Justin Trudeau, the young, untried leader of the Liberal Party, which left office kind of in disgrace after a bunch of scandals, and is having a very hard time rebuilding its popularity, especially in Quebec. He seems to be having some success in doing that. He was very aggressive in that first debate, and the Liberal popularity among voters, didn't rocket, but it gradually crept up after that. And NDP popularity, which to the surprise of an awful lot of observers, had been very high, to the point where the NDP, for the first time in history, looked as if it had a chance of actually forming a government in Canada. Up until now, it's always been something between a fringe party and a more important third party, but never anything more than just a third party. The NDP was actually in the lead with a reasonably strong lead of a few percentage points over the Tories and the Liberals. That lead seems to be evaporating. The Liberals seem to be benefiting. We're not going to be sure, of course, what kinds of trends are taking hold until closer to the election in October. But the fact that the Canadian economy is now officially in recession, or has been for the first half of the year, and we just found that out when the second quarter GDP numbers just came out this morning, I think will have an impact. I think the impact of the scandals that the Conservative government has been pretty successful in refusing to discuss up to now might eat away at their popularity. We should be beginning to see some interesting trend lines forming in the coming weeks.
Great. We'll look forward to seeing you next month and see where things are then. Jay Bryan, Colin Reed, thanks a lot for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.